Welcome, Diana.
Why, thank you.
Honestly, thank you for taking the time during this busy season. So maybe you can tell everyone a little bit about you, just in general, in your career and your family, and how did you get interested in Dunebrook?
Well, first of all, I want to say that when you said Dunebrook is 33 years old, you just sent me into shock. How could that be?
Right.
Thanks. I worked in the prosecutor's office, and I worked for Cynthia Hedge, who really is the matriarch for child abuse prevention in LaPorte County.
Wow.
So I worked for Cynthia, and we formed a committee. I think she formed it maybe even before I was there, called the LaPorte County Child Abuse Prevention Council.
Mm-hmm.
And it was people working with children, school counselors, nurses, people from the prosecutor's office, child protective services workers, policemen, and some people from private clubs in the community, Les Radke being one, who would get together once a month to talk about issues or concerns we had about children's issues. And the number one issue was convincing people in the community that we had a problem with child abuse, and raising awareness. So that's how this whole thing began, was this group. We would get together and commiserate and build each other up. Then we would have speakers come in and talk to us about different facets. And then we decided in April, which is Child Abuse Prevention and Awareness Month, that we would host something. So we would host a dinner or a luncheon and have speakers come in and talk about it. And out of those meetings became the concern of, well, where are we interviewing children? When we have a child abuse report, they were being interviewed in police departments, which was not good.
Horrible.
It was horrible. There was a video at one time of a child who was a molest report, who was being interviewed in a police station, sitting in a policeman's chair, in an adult chair. The child was maybe 4 or 5.
Oh, right.
The police officer, the investigator who was interviewing the child, was so uncomfortable talking, didn't know how,
Right.
what words
They're not
to
trained,
use. They're
right,
not trained.
Diana?
He was
Not their
trained-
fault, by the
not-
way.
not
the
his
police,
fault.
not
No,
the
absolutely.
Or same thing with an emergency room. Not their fault. They don't know.
Exactly. He
Right.
was trained to interview an adult, and somebody collecting information. By the time this interview with the child ended, the child had slid off the chair, underneath the chair. And that was kind of the point where we said, wait a minute, this committee, we need to do things differently. And really, that was kind of the catalyst event for creating a Dunebrook.
Wow, that is so great. And then when it was started, so the key players really, Diana, you, Les Radke,
Cynthia Hedge, Betty Trickler.
Yeah. Gosh.
Joe wasn't involved at that point.
Okay.
When it was really Les who brought the Michigan City Exchange Club, and the LaPorte had an exchange club at the time. They were also involved. They were kind of the beginning people. Like I said, Cynthia Hedge was huge, and Betty Trickler, who was a nurse in the community.
Right. What a great woman she was.
She was a great woman. Absolutely.
You wouldn't want to mess around with Betty.
No, you wouldn't want to mess around with Betty. And I never messed around with Betty.
No.
I admired her immensely. Judy Lang was another person from the prosecutor's office who was heavily involved. So that group, from that group, we decided to incorporate through Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, which was a new organization at the time, and Cynthia Hedge sat on their board. So we pursued incorporation, and that was not an easy process because that was Prevent Child Abuse Indiana.
Yes.
But we also wanted to combine prevention and intervention, which other places that we saw didn't do both. And
they did one or the other.
They did. And Glenn Lebesnick was a part of that early group and had McDonald's and had his offices down at 101. He would host the meetings, so we brought this group of people together. There were several rooms that we could meet in.
Right.
It would get so intense, sometimes we'd have to take a break and move to different places because the prevention people wanted to make sure the prevention part was protected, and the intervention people wanted to make sure intervention was protected. So they were both strong wills, but we worked it out, and really Dunebrook became a model for prevention and intervention together, which we used to say a lot. Prevention and intervention together. One is not stronger or more important than the other. They're both really important. And we knew that the first battle that we had, which we'd been addressing, was just raising awareness that abuse is happening in our community. People, that's hard to talk about because it's a subject that people, they'll say abuse is happening, but they really don't want to know the details or understand how impactful it can be.
And I think, well, first of all, thank you, Diana. That is just so fascinating to me because I have a glimmer of how challenging it was when you talk about, first just meeting, then incorporating, then the within the group, the difference between intervention and prevention, and then to just get started and up and going. I mean, it took time and money and...
It did. So in the beginning, before we decided on a building, when we just weren't sure where we were headed, Glenn Lebesnick donated an office space. So the first director was Betty Brew.
Yes.
And she was the one employee.
Yeah.
And her office was at Glenn's at the...
what is that, Barker Road?
No, it was on Washington, not 101, but 100.
Okay.
So that's how we started.
Okay.
And then we succeeded in getting incorporated. I think it was Cynthia Hedge. Our incorporation papers were Cynthia Hedge, Les Radke, and Gail Marsh.
Oh, right, Gail Marsh.
And so then there came the reality of, well, gee, it would be nice to have a place where we could interview children, where we could have prevention. How are we going to do that?
Right.
So one thing that happened was that Glenn Lebesnick, who would say location, location, location.
Yeah, you would know that from the restaurant business.
That's right. I would ride around with him in a car, and we would drive around. We knew we wanted to be between Michigan City and LaPorte
so
because that was the
Love
population center. We wanted to be a little more south of here, a little bit more toward LaPorte, but we couldn't find anybody. A very nice woman had offered to give us property off of 35. And I was excited about that. I thought, yes. I mean, she was giving it to us.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was a lovely location. Glenn said, location, location, location.
Wow.
And we literally went door to door asking people, would
we
you
have your
be
house?"
interested? And Glenn didn't mind doing that.
Right.
And then the person who owned this, his name was Charlie, was an Exchange Club member.
Oh,
And one thing
Well, there
led to
you go.
another,
Yeah.
and he was willing to sell us this property, which was a house.
Right.
So then, okay, we have a property. Well, how are we going to make that house into
Office.
this place? And Glenn Lebesnick was willing to oversee the construction, but then we needed to find people to construct. And we went to our first step. I think the first step was we went to LaPorte County Builders Association. And at some point, and it maybe through Glenn, but we got Ton and Blank involved, which is how we got Joe.
Right.
And then we were lined up to go to the building and trades, and we created this whole presentation to give to them about why we needed a Dunebrook and would they do it. So we went into this meeting, and I can remember being really nervous, hoping that we would be able to convince them. And they were all, they were unions, they were trades, they were. So we walked in, we started the presentation, and one of the people said, well, we have a question. Do you need a furnace? Do you need, and there was never a doubt that they were going to do it.
Wow.
Oh my
They
gosh,
just-
that is amazing.
Dunebrook, I think that the thing that is just the best about it is really Dunebrook was created by the community.
That's what I say
Everybody
too,
stepped
Diana.
up.
Yes, and that's one of the big things about with my job as development is can honestly say Dunebrook is a community business. Organization.
It is.
It's not a national program. It is something because there was a need in the community,
Right.
and people saw that and they wanted to make it happen. And so all the money that's raised here stays here.
Right,
and it actually
right.
goes back into the
Right,
community
right.
because. That's what makes
Right.
this organization great, especially.
In the very beginning, right before we started this, the prosecuting attorney sent Judy Lang and I, Al Christensen, who was a
Yeah,
Michigan
I
City
remember
police
Al.
detective,
Yeah.
and another detective, I can't think of his name right now. They sent us to Alabama, Huntsville,
Oh, that's
Alabama,
right.
because
That's right.
they did great intervention training, interviewing
Okay.
children,
Mhm.
and out there was a children's advocacy center,
Oh, okay.
strictly preventive.
Mhm.
So we kind of saw the model there.
Mhm.
But yes, I agree. It's kind of based on that model, but the great thing is it was completely a LaPorte County thing.
Mhm.
Right.
It's just amazing.
But
Porter County.
Diana, for us to hear and for our community to hear exactly what you were saying, and Lisa, to have Al Christensen, and I knew Al, I remember him, big old rough guy.
Right.
To go with you down to Alabama to learn about that child advocacy center. And I just want to clarify for some who don't know the difference between intervention and prevention. Some don't understand that. Intervention, we did 420 interviews here last year. So when Diana's talking about the realization, it was actually 32 years ago, not 33. We're working on 33, but 32 years ago, to talk about intervening and helping children when there's a case. Department of Child Services gets the call, and we need to interview, not only to begin the healing process for the child and the family, because it's always a family issue, but to try to prosecute. And of course, you saw the ugly of ugly with child abuse in your work in the prosecuting office.
Well, so that you bring that up. It's a great start of what was happening. There'd be a report of child abuse that would go to the, in fact, my role for a while in the prosecutor's office was to review all child abuse reports.
Wow.
And then I would pull out the reports that seemed to have some substance to them. And,
Substance as in we can bring this to court.
well, no, just substance that
A bad
Something
situation.
There's some,
literally
there's some
abuse going on.
There's
Okay, okay.
It was with the 210s, the initial
Report.
from CPS.
Mhm.
And then I would check to see, well, what's the status? What's happening? I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to do with it, but it seemed that I needed to find out. So here's a case that alleged some abuse that seems to be a legitimate thing. So where is this case? Has it gone to the police? And I would go check with the police, and they would say, the department, well, no, there's nothing going here. That Child Protective Services took care of it. But wait a minute, it looks like maybe there's a criminal charge in here.
Right.
And they weren't talking to each other. Or sometimes
That's so
the police
interesting.
would have the report. They would assume that CPS had it,
And didn't.
and CPS didn't
Wow.
have it. Of course, CPS, they were about the welfare of the child.
Right.
And the police, they were about the criminal
Right.
Yeah.
charge.
Yeah.
But they didn't talk to
Right.
each other.
Right.
So in the very beginning when Dunebrook first started, our goal was to have law enforcement and CPS here, teams, which was kind of the model that we saw
Alabama.
in Huntsville, Alabama. So in the beginning, we worked really hard to get protocols from signed with all the police departments to put a person here. And in the beginning, we did that. We had state police came out and used us. We had Michigan City police officer Sue Harrison
Yeah.
was one of
right.
the first out
Yeah.
here. Larry Trueblood was from the sheriff's
Uh-huh.
office. And then we had Linda Chuck, who was and Connie Van Slyke from CPS, who were out here. And then we'd have deputy prosecutors come in and out. It started out good, but that didn't work. That model just really didn't work for us. And it was not long before the whole idea of having an interviewer trained and
Sure.
out here, that we kind of evolved to that. I can't tell you how much it warms my heart to hear that. It makes me sad that there are that many
Right.
reports,
Cases.
but I am so happy that Dunebrook is involved in those cases.
Well,
doing the
and I can
interview.
tell you that concept, see again, that fascinates me, that was how it got started, was getting all of those parties talking to each other.
Right.
Prosecuting attorneys, police, law enforcement, and Department of Child Services. So that is what we now term as the multidisciplinary team
Right.
that is involved in some of the cases, depending upon the severity of the
Right.
case. So they meet here sometimes while the interview is going on, because the interview is taped and the child is told it's taped.
Right.
And that is for prosecuting purposes, but it is a challenge still today, because they're all very busy, those entities. Department of
Right.
Child Service, prosecuting attorney, law enforcement. But I think the education that you all started about the severity of the issue has only grown and grown and grown.
Right. Well, I think great kudos to all of you that you continue to work through that and have accomplished so much. It really, in the beginning, there was a point where the board considered not doing the interview piece anymore, because we were struggling with getting all the parties to continue to do that every time there was an election and a change in president.
Right, exactly. I have to mention Angie Marsh is our director of our Child Advocacy Center, and she does a fabulous
She
job
does.
of coordinating all those, which is not easy.
No.
Right.
Well, and we were coming from a place for a police officer whose charge was to look at criminal charges in a case. Of course he wants to protect his investigation.
Yes.
And the prosecutor wanted that.
Yes.
So they viewed bringing in CPS
Mhm.
or somebody like Dunebrook
As
as an intrusive and maybe going
Yes.
to mess up their part of
Yes.
the case.
Yes.
Which
Going
was
to mess
understandable.
up. Yep.
And for the CPS worker who is working on keeping the child safe, their role as far as law enforcement was a shady area.
Sure,
so
sure.
everybody was kind of reluctant.
Yeah, right.
Nobody wanted to collaborate.
No,
Well-
they wanted to collaborate, but they didn't want to give up their peace,
Yes,
which is
yes,
understandable.
yes,
I mean,
right.
because that's the way we were trained.
Well,
and
and
that's
it's
the way
just,
we do
I
things.
think it's, Diana, what you said is, because I still hear the stories of if you ask a wrong question, say one of our interviewers asks the wrong
Right,
question
you'll
the
blow
wrong
my
way,
case.
you'll blow it for a prosecuting attorney or law enforcement. So that is just the nature of the beast problem, but only by them talking and meeting and understanding each other's needs, which they now do. So again, that is that intervention piece, which is so crucial. But I have to tell you, I'll never forget when I interviewed almost 7 years ago now, and they asked me that question. So what's your belief about intervention versus prevention is one more. I thought, and as a therapist and a school counselor, I'm like, they're both so important. And why would you even, I didn't even understand why they asked that question, and now I know, because certain entities think one is more important than the other.
So I used to work in South Bend,
Mm-hmm.
in St. Joe County, like I was here, then I was there,
Mm-hmm.
and then I came back here.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a point where they would send us interviews in order to help us keep going. Like if they,
wow.
the like St. John's and counties attached
Outlying area. Mhm.
attached to St. Joe
Mm-hmm.
and to us
Mhm.
would go to St. Joe because they had a really good
Yeah, the Casey Center.
yes
Yes.
had a really good interviewing
Yes.
thing, and they understood. In fact, we were created just before they were.
Huh.
So
They're such a bigger community, right?
They are a
so their
bigger
volume of cases was.
yes, but they also, like the director at the Casey Center in the beginning. In fact, when I went to St. Joe, I was over the director there
Mhm.
because they had that kind of a relationship through the prosecutor's
Sure.
office. So when I came back here, for a while we were doing the interviews we had, which were maybe 20 or 30 a year.
Wow.
Wow.
80% of those were not local because we were having a
Oh,
hard
I
time
see.
getting local
To
to.
buy into.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Right.
I'm so glad. I am so glad that piece, that the board didn't give up on it
Yeah.
and kept it,
Yeah.
because I think it's such a valuable piece,
Yeah.
along with all the family services and
Sure.
prevention, which is so important too.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. Oh my gosh, Diana, so very interesting. Well, thank you for that explanation.
Oh,
I mean, now
a
we'll have
pleasure.
that always documented so people can tune in. Really, we'll put it on our website to know the history.
Mhm.
And what I guess in summary of that, and I want to get on to what you think about what needs to happen in the future in our society and the pandemic and how that affects. But is there anything else you'd want to tell us about your 13 years, right, of being director, and how things changed in those 13, or the challenges, or
Well, probably the most challenging physical thing was that we outgrew the little building that we were in, which I can't remember, was it maybe 2,000 square feet? And when those contractors came in and they took that house and turned it into Dunebrook, they gutted it. I mean, they took it all the way down.
studs.
We raised more money than we needed. Oprah Winfrey
Yeah.
gave
Yes,
us a
yes,
challenge
yes,
grant
yes, yes.
because I wrote to her. I wrote a letter because I'd happened to see one of her shows that talked about child abuse, and her office called me, and we were wanting to have her. We knew that she had a home in the area. We were
Right.
wanting to have her do a fundraiser for us. And I'd written to her about that, and her office called and said, well, how much money do you need? I had no idea because we weren't to that point
Sure.
yet. I don't know. But I didn't want to pass, so I said, I don't know, $50,000. Okay, well, I'll call you back. Called back and he said, well, Miss Winfrey would like to give you the $50,000, but and you have to raise $150,000.
Right. Wow.
I called Les Radke, who was president of the board, and I said, I think I've done something wrong. So please don't be mad at me.
Huh?
Well, what did you do? Well, I wrote Oprah. She responded, and she is giving us a challenge grant. He says, what? So because at that point we didn't have a financial plan.
Right.
Anyhow, fast forward, we needed more space, and Tunham Blank, through Joe Core, again stepped up and said, sure, we'll help. What do you want? How much? And he came out. At first, we just were going to add to one end of the building. That didn't seem to be a good idea. Purdue Northwest, the architecture students did plans for us.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, truly, it is a community.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a community. But so then we get to the point where they were going to add on, and they added on around us. They literally took the building down around us.
Mm-hmm.
I never left my office, until I moved to my new office.
Right.
They completely worked around us. That had to be so hard
Right.
for them.
Mm-hmm.
They literally, there was a state police officers came out and they took down the old building that had been left inside with wheelbarrows and knocking the bricks down.
Oh my goodness.
It
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
So that's physically the changes in the 13 years. But what would you
Yes.
say, big picture, Diana? How did you see it grow and the challenges in those 13 years? Because you were here from what year to what year?
Oh, I don't remember.
Oh, gosh, okay.
Yeah.
But 13 years of growth.
Right.
What anything interesting you want to tell us about that aside from the physical, like the community and how they learned and?
Well, I think that on the interviewing piece,
Mm-hmm.
we went from struggling
Wow.
we didn't have a full-time interviewer for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
struggled with getting the prosecutor to use the facility.
Mm.
There came one point where he said to me that he told police, if you go out there, I won't prosecute your case. And then,
Wow, see, those are the challenges.
right. So that was a huge change, and that prosecutor even started making the change, and then being able to hire a full-time forensic interviewer was just amazing. We had ups and downs during that time. We received a large federal grant
Mm-hmm.
that allowed us to do more of the prevention part and to broaden our scope and reach out into Porter County
Right.
and into surrounding counties.
Mm-hmm.
That was big. It was a great opportunity that didn't continue.
Yeah.
But like nurturing parenting class,
Right.
that was the first class we had out here.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
That was the first class.
Right.
So, and that still goes,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So there's that, and then community partners and
Right.
healthy families.
Healthy families.
Those are,
Yay.
yes.
That's the prevention piece that
right.
is added on.
And body safety.
But I still think raising awareness
Yes,
is such an
right.
issue.
Right.
I think I used to, when I would go out and talk, people believe that there's child abuse,
Yeah.
but I think that we don't. It's like looking at
Right.
a car wreck.
Right.
You don't want to see it, and I think that's probably the most similar thing. Dunebrook was created originally. The council was created to raise awareness of abuse,
Right.
and I think that's still a valid
Right. Right.
goal.
Right. Well, thank you. Honestly, that is so true. And we talked a little bit before the program started about helping Joe Average. It's the same thing when, again, being a school counselor for a while, when a child in a classroom has a friend who possibly had an abuse issue and they talk about it, that empowers not only our education in the school system, empowers the individual who's been abused, but maybe the innocent bystander.
Right.
If you see something, say something.
Yes.
And not to be afraid of saying something. If you're a neighbor and you think there might be abuse going on somewhere in your neighborhood, you don't have to
Absolutely.
diagnose it. You don't have to know if really the little boy fell down the stairs and that's why he has a bump on his face, or you have a suspicion that it's something. Just call Department of Child Services, explain just what you know, and let them investigate it. Because when Department of Child Services or the prosecuting attorney's office or law enforcement has a series of reports,
Yeah.
then we have an issue.
Exactly. That is probably the hardest thing with the most recent death that happened in LaPorte. That made me so sad because just before I left Dunebrook, there was a little girl that died under similar circumstances. And we talked a lot. There were reports in the newspaper that talked about neighbors realizing
Yeah.
that there was something up
Right.
about that family. Children need adult voices in their
Mhm.
lives. And as you said, reporting doesn't mean you need to know for sure that it's happening. You don't need to prove anything. It's not up to you. If you see something, say something really fits for this.
Right.
Be a
And I would
voice.
say, the recent mass shooting that happened, that
Mm.
boy and his parents, people that abuse or people that do violent acts, there's a reason.
Right.
It's either mental health or they're stressed beyond belief and they think they have no options than to do something horrible.
Right.
So we all have to take responsibility for making our world work.
Right.
So when you see someone troubled, you're not responsible, but to help them get help or report it.
There are two sayings that come to mind as you're saying that. One is the African village. It takes a village
Yeah.
to raise a
Yes.
child.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
really
Yeah.
does.
Mhm.
I can remember my brother getting caught playing hooky from school because the neighbors noticed that the drapes were closed in the house
Yeah.
when they would have never been closed during the day by my mom.
Right.
So that's how she found out
Right.
that. So it takes a village. We all need
we have to be
support
eyes out
of
for
that.
others, yeah.
The other thing, though, that is so, I don't know, endemic of our culture, another African story that I read about was in this African village, if you did something wrong, or if I did something wrong, they would come, let's say I stole your chicken, they would come and they would put me in a cage in the middle of the village, and people would come and shout at me how good I am
Oh.
and how loved I am until I agreed until they were convinced that I believed that I am good. And I'm thinking,
Wow.
that's a different perspective, isn't
Right.
it?
It
And
is.
maybe we should be doing that.
Right. And I, before I got into being a therapist, I always wondered how in the world could these horrific violent acts, how could someone do that, whether it's abuse or violent shooting or whatever. And when you understand that people have severe problems that never were taught that there are other options to deal with their stress, and that's our prevention
Right.
piece. So thank you, Diana.
Right.
I mean, I agree with you. I think we need to tell people they're loved. And you had an interesting, maybe you want to tell us a little bit, because I know we're up on time, about the Sunday forum and that little tidbit.
Byron Stevenson, who is, he's kind of the creator of social justice.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about the theme for his presentation Sunday was proximity
Mm-hmm.
and being close to one another in order to understand one another. And he was talking not just about black, white, but Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, that we've become so polarized that we're not listening to each other, we're not valuing one another, and that if we're close in to each other, we can value one another, we can learn that, we can have dialogue.
Right.
And I thought, well, that would work for this too, wouldn't
There
it?
you go.
There you go.
And that's the beauty of having the thought that kind of way in the world of being open-minded, especially in this pandemic time with differences of opinion. And what the country's been through in the last 5 years, I would say, is to take the time to listen. You don't have to agree with someone, but try to respect and know
Right.
that when someone's struggling, or maybe they're rude to you out, to be patient and try. It's very
Exactly.
hard to do. It's very hard
It
to
is.
do, but to be the light. So, well, Diana, I cannot thank you enough.
That was
honestly.
great history. I'm taking notes
Oh.
here, you know, like, because
Thank
it's
you.
really good to hear.
I've enjoyed this, and I love that Dunebrook is in such good hands.
Well, thank